All right, folks, we'll get started here. Welcome to this webinar from JFrog on data-driven DevOps. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Jagan Subramanian. I'm the VP of Solution here at JFrog. Just a quick intro of the team here. The solution organization is made up of solution architects. A lot of our customers and people who discuss various architecture issues and architecture implementations for our products. This is the team that they interface with. Another part of the organization deals with a lot of the integration work with the different tools that you guys use. So, if you're using Mesosphere or OpenShift, etc., these are the kind of integration that another part of my organization works on. And finally, I'm sure a lot of you guys have enjoyed our R&D level support that helps you guys with any questions you have, both from managing any crisis as well as new things that you want to do with our tools. I also wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about myself, which is a little bit relevant to the topic that we're discussing. Prior to joining JFrog, I was at Oracle for a little over 16 years, having done a bunch of things, but most recently being part of a huge DevOps transformation in the middleware organization. So some of the things that we'll discuss today, I also wanted to sort of highlight that these are things that I have experienced. I know the challenges that you guys go through while going through this transformation. So I would like to share some of the experience that I have had and also talk about some of the things that we did to succeed in this area. So we'll start with the agenda a little bit here. Okay. So just a quick overview of what all are the things that we'll cover. I just wanted to give a quick recap of what transformation means. I know all of you guys are doing a lot of this, but just as a reminder, and how it matters to metrics, and how thinking of metrics in the same transformation helps. As promised in the webinar description, I'll give you or I'll share with you a few metrics that'll help you guys get going today, and then how to get it together, and then we'll open it up for questions. So all of you guys are already in some milestones in terms of this transformation. So just a quick recap for you guys here. Obviously, this whole thing started with trying to break down these silos. Traditionally, we have these different organizations. We can add other organizations to it, like security and compliance teams as well. But the traditional approach was that each team was fairly self-contained. Dev would do their work, throw it over this wall over to QA, and QA would try to struggle with it, and then eventually the operations guys are left with the burden of deploying things, right? So obviously this whole DevOps transformation is about bringing these teams together right from the get-go, right? The intersection of these three departments or four departments, we can keep calling it DevSecOps, etc., is really what DevOps is all about, right? Now, when you started on this transformation, obviously, you started with some sort of a process around trying to start this, journey of changing the way the organization is working together, working towards common goals, etc. And at least for us back at Oracle, this was quite a large effort and cross-team effort, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys. What we followed as a process, sorry, the poll is still showing up. Do I need to close it? I think it's just on your screen. Okay, apologies for that. Okay, so for us, what this meant was basically starting with, as anything else, identifying the root issues that we want to resolve, or the problems in the current system, or basically finding solutions for newer things as teams move towards more cloud-centric models of working, right? And it starts with finding those champions in those different teams we already talked about, from dev, from QA, from ops, who will want to experiment with you. So hopefully you are engaging those folks already and involving them in coming up with these patterns and best practices that you think will resolve these issues. So you identified for your issues, you identified some solutions for it. Now is the time to try and ensure during doing multiple proof of concepts and experiments to vet out that these things will work. Now, once you're done with this experiment, you have some patterns, you have some methodologies that seem to make sense to you with those early set of teams and thought leaders in these different organizations, right? The next step is to implement. Just having an experiment is not enough. You will implement it. Implementing means now you're getting ready to make sure that you have the right onboarding guides, you have the right infrastructure underneath that can sustain the other organizations coming on board, right? However, just implementing does not necessarily mean there will be adoption, right? In my experience, adoption within the organization can be categorized into three types of behaviors. The first behavior is basically early adopters and champions, possibly the people who worked with you during the experiments, who will jump on this, on all the new tools that you're rolling out, on all the new processes that you're rolling out. And these are really, sort of early indicators of your success. This is also the team that's going to push the central teams onwards to do more things, and this is a good thing, right? However, this is going to be a smaller part of the organization. In my experience, it's roughly about 10 to 15% of the organization that falls into this category, right? Then there will be a slightly larger set of teams that say, hey, what you're saying is making sense. I can understand why these early adopters are jumping on it. Tell us what to do, and we will do it. I see value in what you're doing it. And this is typically about 20% of the organization that says, okay, great, you have good ideas. I'm willing to take the leap of faith here and try this out. And then there's the larger part of the organization, right? Roughly about 60% of the organization that says, you know what, I've been doing this for many years. I know exactly what to do here. Why are you changing anything? I don't believe this change will make many improvements. Now, here is where some of these metrics start making sense, right? Because when you're doing this adoption, and even earlier on, hopefully you thought about measuring it as well, right? And what happens with the measurements here is these early adopters and measuring their success will help you to pull along those what I would call a little bit of disbelievers in the organization, and also help you evaluate, right? So you came up with some ideas, you came up with some best practices and methodologies and tools. Actually, the adoption will tell you whether some of these things need to be reevaluated, and this is a continuous cycle. As you can see, it's a cyclical process here. It doesn't end, right? Nobody says that I'm done with DevOps, really, right? So you have to go back to evaluating what you implemented. And for us, as an example here that I would say is like, when we started this process, we had this great idea of saying, you know what, we'll have a centralized Jenkins master with a lot of resources to do the builds. But it's kind of centralized because we thought that no team really cares about managing this infrastructure or wanting more access to this sort of centralized infrastructure. Very soon, what happened was we saw that people actually the teams actually wanted more autonomy. Whether they really used the autonomy was different, but yes, having a centralized infrastructure made it a bigger bottleneck. We couldn't upgrade the system. We couldn't have any kind of downtime. And by the way, if something happened to the centralized system, everybody got affected. So this was something we very quickly learned that we probably need to go to a more of a multi-master model. Again, your situation might be slightly different, but this is what we see when you have multiple teams wanting to work on a common infrastructure. So this is just an example to say that right from the get-go, we decided that measuring things even during the initial adoption was important. The other aspect of the measurement is that what happens is during the DevOps transformation, what we saw was the initial few months, there was a lot of euphoria around the new tools, new things we were doing, right? But pretty soon, management and other teams wanted to start asking questions about, hey, that was great. This was disruptive. You probably went through a code refactoring as a result of the new methodologies. There might have been slight changes to the release plans, etc. Pretty soon, people are going to ask you, why did we do it? Was it useful? And you know what? If you're not measuring, some of the common things that come up is, you don't have some of these answers. They range from, what I would say is just, your own infrastructure and the new tools that you rolled out to actually the functional usage of this DevOps tools, right? So it starts from, hey, do you know how robust your infrastructure is? There was a lot of investment done for new tools and new systems to be put in place. If it is not as robust or better than the previous system, what is the point, right? The other thing is the efficient use of resources. One of the challenges that ops teams generally have, and hopefully this you got as a feedback during the early experimentation with the ops folks, is, typically when you come down to measuring, like, are the resources being used by the right teams? Are the resources being used on the right projects? You actually need to measure to make sure that you have the right, it's actually delivering better value than the previous legacy systems, right? Another one to think about is the measurement of work. You might have rolled out, this is very good for you to see if there is actually adoption of the new processes in the right cadence, right? There's also a good measure for you to say that, hey, you know what, at this rate of adoption, do I need to secure more resources for the future, right? And surprisingly, even today, getting things as basic as more storage or more compute is still has a lead time, right? Other things to see is, like, was there an improvement in the release cadence? Now, this comes over a period of time, but you need to start measuring, if there's a forward progress here, right? And finally, it all comes down to saying that, what was the cost of the change? Can we measure in terms of either disruptiveness? By the way, there might be slight slowdowns there, which is okay, as long as there is some forward progress that you can measure, right? Lastly, you remember those 60% of the teams? Metrics is a good way to convince that the change was valuable, right? If you're not able to measure, they will not believe that there is any improvement, right? And the same mantra of saying, I knew it better and I don't have to change, will continue, right? So how do we move from this, and how do we use metrics to be something that actually starts building the trust? Remember the three teams that you're working with? In terms of implementing the new tools, the new methodologies, those teams are the ones that you need to collaborate right from the beginning, right? In terms of even what to be measured, right? Imagine if the ops team and the QA team and the dev team were able to discuss together that what is the measure of true success here, right? It breaks down barriers. Otherwise, you'll continue to have metrics isolation, and teams are not collaborating or not agreeing on what is success here, right? So as an example, if you're talking about developer productivity in some sense here, does it make sense to just count, in terms of, like, did the build time go down? Or do you want to actually talk about what is the success and failure rate? And success and failure rate here might mean, input from QA as an example to say, hey, is it really, if team A is producing something, is it really of the quality that it can be consumed by somebody else? This brings up another question of, producer and consumer teams. In large organizations, you have team A producing something being consumed by team B. If team A says, hey, I'm producing 5 times a day and it's clearing my tests, but team B says, you know what, I haven't picked up your bits from over a week ago. Having the right measures and having people collaborate on coming up with these measurements is really important in that sense. The other thing we did was, actually, we were quite fanatic about the transparency of data, right? One of the key challenges in existing systems is when measurements are made and it's not very clear how those measurements were gathered, there's a little bit of a disbelief in that, right? So what we decided was, instead of saying that, hey, why does somebody need access to some sort of data, we said, why not, right? We made sure that we built tools and we built mechanisms for people to query the entire system and be able to build their own dashboards if needed. We did provide some basic dashboards for people to inspect. Again, we fought against this idea of saying that the data is too hard to gather, too hard to expose. Instead, we said this is going to be one of the key things we do. And obviously, as a result of it, there's continuous improvement, right? If you're looking and measuring at the data and having an open mind about inputs from different teams, what we saw was very quickly those 60% got very used to this data and started pushing us for more changes. The other thing is the comparative data drives changes as well, right? So if you have team A that is following the new processes and succeeding, and team B is a little bit of a laggard, believe me, that product VP is going to take a hard look and help you drive that change, right? I talked about a little bit about the multi-master as a challenge in the previous slides. One of the things that we saw was a lot of the self-service drives ownership. So the capability for teams, and this not only is having advanced capabilities in terms of managing resources, provisioning masters, or having the ability to create repositories and Artifactory as an example. This also goes to having the ability to create those dashboards and build out those metrics. Because as teams started getting access to the, going back to the transparency here, as people started having access to the data, we got people very excited in terms of measuring things and giving feedback, right? And finally, in large organizations, and this depends on how large organization is, there's a question of chargeback, right? So going back to measuring whether team A might be using most of the resources, but is not really developing the products or delivering the products that are critical to the business needs. These are other inspections that can be done, right? So, this is all great about some of these things that we want to do. What we want to know here is, where should we start, right? There's a lot of data, and what do we do about starting to looking at at some of this info, right? So I wanted to, if you have sort of attended SwampUp or seen my previous video, you've seen me talk about types of metrics, and for me they're broadly categorized as two, right? So there's operational metrics about the systems. These are a lot of different metrics that you can bring up to measure whether your service levels are what you promised as improvements are improving or have achieved what you wanted to achieve, or you're using efficient resources, or you're having some predictive analytics to tell you whether you will have an avoidable outage, like you ran out of storage. Believe me, there are so many support tickets that we get where eventually we find out the root cause was something simple as not having good insights into the storage needs, right? Similarly, there are a lot of functional metrics as well, right? So around developer productivity, what is the status of your pipeline? How often are you able to push things through the pipeline? And there are many of these, like how good are your gates, etc., right? But today I wanted to focus on a specific use case, right? What I wanted to focus on was, how do you measure developer productivity, right? Especially if you're a manager, you're asking these questions. Is your team efficient? Is your team doing the right things? How do you measure this? Some of you are developers here on the call. For you, this is kryptonite. You know exactly how you're going to be measured. This is great, right? Wish somebody had told me this when I was a developer. So I want to start with a little bit of a use case here, right? So as a DevOps manager, you work across multiple teams. You're working with the product management team, QA team, release, developer, ops, etc. You're also working with a plethora of tools, right? What you need is good visibility into each of those individual functions and the related tools, as well as something across the whole pipeline. The challenge you have today is to get real-time data, right? Because you have to work with different teams, you're working with different tools. It would be cool that if you had a centralized view across all of this, all of these processes and tools, right? So what do you do today? What you do today is possibly one option is doing some sort of a weekly health check. You have multiple tools. Each of those tools have their own reporting mechanism, right? You probably, and in some cases, you need to leverage other teams to get this data, right? It's a very reactive way of doing it, right? Obviously, needless to say, it's outdated, because by the time you collect and absorb the information and come to some conclusions, it's old, right? When we are talking about multiple releases a day and we are looking at sort of a continuous update of software, this is very slow in terms of getting the data, right? The other thing is the information is not correlated, right? So you need to build out these correlations, which is, again, time consuming, right? And at the same time, you cannot do some sort of context-based analysis, right? A good way to think about it, what you would want is a way to have good signals upfront in terms of alerting you of issues that might need immediate attention, right? The other thing is real-time information is what you really are looking for here, right? And wouldn't it be awesome if you could see all of this in one place? The other way is anecdotal information. So not every system is measured today, right? We can see from the responses, people are at different levels of being able to measure. And one of the challenges is that you don't have good tools today that allow you to bring this information together. So you rely on status meetings and updates from different teams, et cetera, right? Again, this is reactive, right? By the time you realize that there are issues from, I don't know, as an example, the stress or performance team, you are way ahead in terms of the release cadence, right? And now, as you find issues very, very late in the cycle, this is going to be more costly to fix. And again, this changes where you are in your release process, right? Early on, you can probably live with some of these issues not having been detected early, but as you get closer to the release dates, this becomes a bigger challenge, right? It's of course prone to human error because this is very subjective information. I'm not discounting the value of subjective information, but without having empirical evidence along with it, this is prone to a lot of interpretation, right? Similarly, there's lack of context because different people look at the data or look at the information from a different angle, right? Needless to say, again, it's time consuming, which means by the time you are able to take any action, it's outdated data, it's very reactive, right? So how do we do this? So as you can see, a lot of it is based on human communication today, which clearly shows that either there is access to information is a little bit challenging, either because of tools or because of ownership. And quite frankly, there is no good way of a consolidated view across the different tools. Let me close this polling window. Okay. So how do you get insights? We started the webinar by talking about 3 metrics that would be important to measure for a dev manager. There are many metrics to consider here, right? But if there are 3 things that you can start with, I would say it starts with sprint accuracy. What do I mean by sprint accuracy? So one of the challenges that we have is knowing whether the way we are scoping a sprint is accurate, right? So this is a good measure. It's great to have a lot of stories in your sprint and do the story pointing, etc. But maybe we should measure how many times do you have stories moving from sprint to sprint, which is a good way of saying that, hey, you know what, our scoping exercises are not good or it's unrealistic, and so how will you ever have a team that will deliver what has been planned, right? Another measure is probably acceptable commits. It's a little challenging, or it's assumed to be challenging, that developer productivity cannot be measured, right? In fact, you can, right? What you need to see for your teams is, like, does it make sense to measure how many commits are happening per developer, and then how many of those commits are actually successful in passing some gates, right? There are other things that can be measured here, in the sense that you can see if certain developers are, the trend is more about committing quite often versus maybe in some cases there are developers who commit less but commit in large chunks. Again, these are patterns that you need to understand to say, from a best practice perspective, very early on in a release, you probably want the commits to be often, so you have smaller chains that you can inspect, right? Towards the end of the release, you probably want to make sure that the amount of commits themselves are diminishing, right? Because you don't want a large amount of changes happening towards the end of the release, which will cause a lot more instability in the system, as an example, right? Lastly, you do want to see the pipeline status. You want to know, how many times are the commits or the delivery of software really succeeding through the pipeline, right? Through your different gates, as well as how many of them are actually being consumed by consuming teams, if that is the case. So in order to help you guys, I wanted to actually share, I hope you guys heard about a recent acquisition that JFrog did. This is a company called CloudMunch. So we've been working on building out some other tools that will actually help you guys in getting these measures, right? This will be called JFrog Insight. We are still working on getting this out. As you guys know already, we want to make sure that the product is robust and answers the pain that you guys have today. But the goal is to have a unified product that connects to all the ecosystem of your tools, including the JFrog products, to give you guys a comprehensive view of what is happening in your DevOps transformation, right? And so as part of it, we're focusing on making sure the tools will give you a lot of predictive analysis. It will be real time and is direct, will be connected to your systems all the time. You will be able to like have context sensitive information. I'll share with you a few of our early design ideas on this, and obviously we work very closely with our customers and partners to get their inputs in. And the key here is that it's a continuous information system, so you will be able to address both the need for folks that need to look at the current situation, as well as management needs of looking at it over time, etc. So as an example, going back to the metrics we talked about, here's an example of a Jira dashboard that brings together a lot of aspects around how your sprints are progressing. So as an example, you can measure things around saying, hey, given the stories in a sprint, do you have more defects occurring because of it, right? Or do you have stories that are getting pushed sprint over sprint, as an example, right? Similarly, here's another view of commit information coming from Bitbucket. So here you can kind of correlate, the work being done in terms of, amount of commits that are happening to even a given file. How many of those commits are resulting in defects or are not tracked to any stories, and then even look at per person, who's doing the highest commit, right? And you can do some interesting trends here over a period of time to say, hey, do you see a pattern where people are committing a lot in the beginning of the week or towards the end of the week? Thereby, sort of you can plan in terms of, when these deliveries can be consumed by other teams as well, right? Another insight is, for example, in terms of Jenkins. So you can do some analysis here to say, hey, based on different usage trends of your Jenkins systems, do you have typically teams being able to pass builds? What is the duration of these builds? You can start tracking if you're committing more code, and is it having an effect on the build time, right? That's a very important information to have, because that just means that there's probably some refactoring to be done there, some modularization to be done there. Especially when you're moving from a monolith to a microservice, this kind of information is really helpful to see that different parts of the entire application, how is it progressing, right? Another way to look at it is some of the Artifactory data. So you are, I'm guessing, using promotions or should be using promotions in Artifactory, which is a good measure of managing gates, right? So similarly, this gives you a little bit of both operational metrics as well as sort of how ready are you in terms of builds being production ready, as an example, right? Finally, we talked about having one pane to look at it. So the product also hopes to bring you guys to a common dashboard that is completely customizable, which can bring together different aspects, from all those different systems together to have a interesting story to tell. Again, these are things that we are working on. It's a product that will be available later on this year, and so look forward to our announcements around these products. I think with that, I'll open up for any questions. I think there's a question from Shri here. So yeah, so as you know, that we work very closely with customers and partners. So at some point later this year, and this information will be made available to you guys shortly, we will have a way for you guys to preview the product and provide us some early feedback. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you, guys. Bye.